Good evening and welcome everyone on behalf of the Boston Public Library and the Citywide Friends of the Boston Public Library. Welcome to this next program in the Talks for Better Living series this month in honor of Black History Month. I'm Kristen Motti, an adult programs librarian at the Boston Public Library. Excuse me, we're so glad you've joined us this evening. Our bookstore partners for this evening's program is Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass., and they are happy to ship signed copies of Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's books to you nationwide. Use the code BPL26 in the comments box for your signed copy. We'll put the link to the order page in the chat throughout the program, or check your local library. Before we begin, just a few items of housekeeping. If you have a question for Dr. Tatum at any time, please type it in the Q&A box. We will get to that toward the end of the program. Closed captioning or subtitles can be turned on or off with the CC button on the bottom of your screen, the show caption screen. And we will share a few relevant links with you throughout the program in the chat. We'll meet Dr. Tatum in just a moment. She'll start with a presentation, then be joined by Fred Golder, who is Citywide Friends board member and the BPL's collaborator on this series, for a moderated conversation before we open it up to you for audience Q&A toward the end of the program. First, a little bit about tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. She's an award-winning educational leader, clinical psychologist, and best-selling author. Widely recognized for her work on race, education, and leadership, Dr. Tatum is perhaps best known for her groundbreaking book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? A catalyst for national conversations about the psychology of racism and the power of honest dialogue. A former president of Spelman College and a sought-after speaker, Dr. Tatum brings decades of experience in higher education to her latest book, Peril and Promise: College Leadership in Turbulent Times, published last fall. In it, she explores how American universities hold key to addressing ignorance and division that threaten our society if bold and courageous leaders step up. Dr. Tatum holds a BA from Wesleyan University, a PhD in clinical psychology, and an MA in psychology from the University of Michigan, and an MA in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Through her writing and speaking, she continues to inspire change agents across sectors to lead with clarity, empathy, and purpose. So we look so forward to meeting Dr. Tatum in just a moment. Now, to welcome on behalf of the Citywide Friends of the Boston Public Library, here's Fred Golder.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm just delighted to have Dr. Tatum come and speak. And I have to tell you that I read Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And I said, boy, if we can get her to come to the Boston Public Library, particularly for Black History Month, how fortunate. And sure enough, she's here. And she's going to share her wisdom. And I will tell you that listen carefully. And if you don't get it all from the talk tonight, go out and buy her book. I have a copy of myself, Peril and Promise, and also Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? So please, Dr. Tatum, spend more time talking than listening. So here I go. Go ahead. Take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here in conversation with you, Fred, and with the Boston Public Library community, and looking forward to our conversation. I know there are a number of things that we could talk about, but I thought it might be a good place to start to just situate our conversation a little bit in my own personal connection to Boston and libraries, not particularly the Boston Public Library, but a long advocate of libraries and the beneficiary of them as well. I grew up not far from Boston in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, and I want to tell a little bit about how I came to live in Bridgewater back in 1958. That's when my parents moved there. I was born in Florida in 1954 in Tallahassee, Florida, which is the year of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. And I like to tell that story not because my birth is so important, but because it tells us something about the time that in which I came of age. My father and mother were both educated at Howard University, HBCUs, and HBCU, and my dad was teaching at Florida A&M, which is also a historically Black university. And in 1954, he had an undergraduate degree in art and a master's degree that he had earned at the University of Iowa, but wanted to get a doctorate so he could advance in higher education. And unfortunately, he was not able to attend Florida State University, which is also in Tallahassee, just across town from Florida A&M, because even after the Brown decision, the state of Florida, like a lot of other southern states, took their time about desegregating. And Florida State remained a whites-only institution for nearly a decade after that Supreme Court decision. But what the state of Florida did in order to comply with the decision was to pay my father's transportation out of the state of Florida. He earned his doctorate at Penn State and State College, Pennsylvania, commuting between Florida and Pennsylvania on the train, and the state of Florida reimbursed him for his train expense. That was how they provided access to higher education for Black graduate students at that time. And I tell that story because it really situates my experience thinking about writing about the issues that I have written about all my life. Because when my parents, in 1957, after my dad finished his degree, they decided they wanted to leave the Jim Crow segregation of the South. My dad looked for a new job and got one at Bridgewater State, what was then called Bridgewater State Teachers College. We now know it today as Bridgewater State University. But back in 1958, my father, Dr. Robert Daniel, became the first African American professor at Bridgewater State. And I grew up in this small New England town, 30 miles from Boston, as one of just a handful of Black children in the school district, often the only Black kid in my class. So I know we're going to talk a lot about belonging, inclusion, racial identity, all of those things. And I can't help but think and understand about my own upbringing that my experience being one of just a few Black kids in that school district and some of the things that I observed and learned about as a young person have informed my research going forward. And I'm happy to be in conversation with you today.
Well, it's interesting. The children today have no appreciation of what it was like back in those days. And it was a difficult time, unfortunately, in those times, but things are better now. And I'm kind of curious. You have a lot of connections to Boston, the Boston area, and now here you are now back in the Boston Public Library, sharing your knowledge with us. We had problems with school busing here in Massachusetts, of all
Yes,
places, and this was during a time when you would be living here in the Boston,
absolutely.
and it was a very difficult time. So tell me, how does this connection to the Boston area, how does it inform your career trajectory and the questions that you raised in why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And we had a conversation before, and I said, maybe we should, instead of calling it that, call it, why aren't we all sitting together in the cafeteria? Go ahead.
Well, let me say a word about the first part of your question, which is, you were talking about the struggle for school desegregation that took place in Boston. And anyone who was alive then and living in the Boston area will remember it well. I was living in Bridgewater, small town, but watching the nightly news, of course, the local Boston stations, and saw a lot of what was going on the TV screen. And I graduated from high school in 1971. So that the late 60s, early 70s activity was very much part of my high school understanding. When I left Bridgewater to go off to college, I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. I was very interested. I knew that I wanted to be a psychologist, and I knew that because, as I said, I have a long history with libraries. I worked in the Bridgewater Public Library as a teenager. I spent a lot of time reading books when I was a child in the children's library, and when I got old enough to have a job, I worked part-time in the Bridgewater Public Library. And when I went off to college, well, before I went off to college, I read a book that I discovered in the library about a psychologist. And I was so inspired by that book that I decided that's what I want to do. I want to be a psychologist. So off I went to Wesleyan, majoring in psychology, and I was very interested in understanding the experiences of Black youth who had grown up in predominantly white communities like I did. At that time in the 70s, if you were reading about Black families in a social science textbook, you would read about families who were living in the rural South or maybe in the urban North, cities like New York or Chicago. But you wouldn't have read anything about families living in small New England towns like I was. So when I finished my degree as an undergraduate and went off to the University of Michigan to pursue my PhD, I decided that I was going to do research on that subject. And I wanted to study the experiences of Black families raising and socializing their children in the context of communities where they represented a very small minority. And that research led to a book, not the one that you read, but my very first book, which was called Assimilation Blues: Black Families in White Communities. And when that book was published, some educators in the Boston area read it. And I was invited to speak to a group of school superintendents who were working in school districts that were participating in a voluntary desegregation program called METCO. Your Boston Public Library listeners will probably recognize the name METCO of a program that was in operation and still operates, bringing, as far as I know, still operates, bringing students, typically Black students in the Boston area, into school districts in the suburban communities surrounding Boston. And those students were often a small handful in the minority, certainly in their suburban school districts. And the principals that I was meeting with, the superintendents that I was meeting with, were asking me this question: why are all the Black kids, those kids in the MECO program, why are those Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? We're trying to voluntarily desegregate our school, and yet the kids are clustering together. Why is that? Well, of course, as you know from reading my book, there are some good reasons that adolescents will seek out people who are having a similar experience, exploring their identities together. And of course, those students riding the bus together to those suburban districts had a lot of time to bond and connect on the bus. In school, they were collecting with their friends. But also, we know that there were sometimes stressors in the school that made a sense of community really important, a sense of belonging really important. And that affirmation of connecting with people who are having a similar experience to you is one that I think many people can understand and appreciate when we really think about it. That said, that research was part of what I was doing as a researcher, but part of what I was doing as a professor was teaching a course on the psychology of racism. And after many years of teaching, I started doing workshops with educators about how they might lead those conversations. Because my college students would ask me, they'd say, Dr. Tatum, why is it that we didn't have these conversations about how racism operates in our society and what we can do about it? Why didn't we talk about that when I was in high school? Why didn't we talk about that when I was in middle school? And when I asked teachers, the teachers I was meeting, talking about my other book, I asked them, well, why don't you have those conversations? They said to me, we don't have them. I don't have them because I'm not sure how to do it. I'm a little bit worried that if I say the wrong thing, I'll create conflict in my classroom, or maybe I'll get in trouble with the other teachers or other parents, or, there was a lot of anxiety about it. And that was in the 80s. Fast forward to the 2000s, 2026, we know there's a lot of anxiety in our currently polarized society to engage in these conversations. And so I decided back then that I was going to do workshops with educators to help them figure out how to create dialogue, productive dialogue in the classroom. And when I did that, I found that there was a real hunger, a real desire on the part of not just students, but also on educators to be able to facilitate productive conversations in their classrooms. And that led to me writing my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? So that information that could be a resource for those educators, as well as parents and others who just want to better understand how to interrupt the cycle of racism in our society.
Now, I know if you read the book, you will know how to do that. But for the people who have not read the book yet, what would you suggest on how to have these productive, constructive conversations dealing with the issues that you have in your book?
Well, one of the things I talk about, I know you know this, Fred, because you read the book, but one of the things I talk about in the book is um, finding, identifying common ground, right? And one of the places where we can see common ground is in our early childhood experiences. When I'm speaking to audiences in person, I will often ask a question, and I'm going to ask it of this audience, even though I can't see who's listening, but I'm going to imagine something. And that is, if we were all in a room together and I were to ask the question, think of your earliest race-related memory. And then I would wait to give you a minute to think, and I would ask, how many of you have thought of something? In my experience, if you do that, almost everyone will raise their hands because most people will remember something that is connected to race from childhood. And then I would ask, well, okay, you've all remembered something, most of you. How old were you at the time that you remembered it? And people would call out ages, and they might say, I did this just the other day. I was speaking somewhere. Someone said as young as 3. Another person said as old as 18. But most people were saying 5, 6, 7. They're typically ages associated with starting school, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And then I would ask, okay, what feeling is attached to this experience that you recall? It happened long ago, but what emotion do you remember? People will often say confusion, fear, embarrassment, sadness, anger. Sometimes you'll hear shame or guilt. Occasionally, and again, just the other day, someone said love, happiness, and curiosity. Curiosity is probably a neutral, positive feeling. Love and happiness, certainly very positive. But for most people, the words are more likely to be more uncomfortable, like anger, like embarrassment, like sadness, like fear, like shame, like confusion. I then like to ask the question, okay, you had that experience, you can recall the feelings attached to it. Let me ask, how many of you had a conversation with a concerned adult, a caring adult, at the time that the incident occurred? Occasionally, there'll be a few hands will go up saying, yes, I did talk to someone, talk to my mom, talk to my teacher, talk to my dad. But most people will say, I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't tell anyone about this experience. And then I ask people to think about, okay, You were 5, you were 6, you were 7, most of you. You still remember it decades later. You can identify the feeling. You tell me you didn't talk to anybody about it. How many of you know 6-year-olds? Your own children or your grandchildren or kids in your neighborhood? How many of you have had some experience with 6-year-olds? Most people can think of experiences they've had with young children. And then I say, see if you agree. A lot of 6-year-olds are very chatty. They tend to share information freely. They often tell things they shouldn't, maybe family secrets. They are just, chatty. They haven't learned to censor themselves in the way that adults do. And yet, here we have an audience full of people who remember this experience at the age when you're quite chatty, and they weren't chatting. They weren't talking about this experience. That is an experience that description that I've just given transcends race. White people will tell you this. People of color will tell you this. Um, and it speaks to the fact that we all, at some point in our lives, early in our lives, learned that the adults in our environment would prefer that we not talk about these sensitive issues. They don't necessarily want to hear about it. Kids will say, adults now will say, when I was a kid, I thought I might get in trouble. I was embarrassed. I didn't have the words. I didn't know what my adult response would be, the parents around me. Sometimes the parents were the source of the confusion. But all of this is to say that if we've learned early not to talk about it, fast forward to being a college student or older than that, and someone says, gee, we ought to have a conversation about this potentially difficult topic. Most people will hesitate. They don't want to do that because they feel deep in their gut, this is going to be hard. I might feel uncomfortable. I might cause somebody else to feel uncomfortable. There might be conflict. But as I like to say, we cannot solve problems if we can't talk about them. So it helps to acknowledge that we all have discomfort, and there might be some more discomfort as we talk, but nothing that we can't work through together. There is a teacher and a learner in every seat. Everybody has something to teach, everybody has something to learn. And our opportunity is to create spaces where we can be in dialogue with each other so that teaching and learning can take place.
My goodness gracious, what the times we have now. Diversity, equity, and inclusion seems to be a really hot button issue now. Some people think of it as, I don't know, maybe giving people privileges they don't deserve or they haven't earned, as opposed to what you and I both know what it really is. And perhaps we need to learn how to reframe or define it in the way that makes it accurate, or perhaps anyway. So tell us
Yes.
about your experience dealing with that.
Yes. Well, certainly, I want to say a word about what is sometimes described as the anti-DEI climate in which we're in now, right now, where people are saying we don't want to use those initials. We don't want to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. And that's really unfortunate because we know that diversity speaks to all of us. I think part of the problem with the letters as we have come to understand them is that some people, when they hear diversity, think we're only talking about the other. We're only talking about the women in an organization dominated by men. We're only talking about the people of color in a context where whites are in the majority. We're only talking about the people who identify as LGBTQ. We're only talking about marginalized groups. And if we understand that diversity includes everyone, then everyone can see themselves in that language. But the way it gets used, not everyone sees themselves that way. I like to use what I call the ABCs: affirming identity, building community, cultivating leadership. When I was a faculty member at Mount Holyoke College, in the 90s. After having taught for quite some time, I became dean of the college at Mount Holyoke. And while I was serving as dean, I described to the students and the staff members with whom I worked that we needed to be working on three things. We needed to be affirming the identity of all of our students. We needed to build a community where everyone felt like they belonged. And we needed to cultivate the leadership of this next generation of leaders, making sure that they knew how to engage with people different from themselves, because you cannot be an effective leader in the 21st century if you don't know how to do that. So that was, I like to say that I was talking about that in the 90s because it was not in response to this moment. But in this moment, I think that language is really helpful, because when we talk about affirming identity, I like to describe it using this analogy. And the analogy is that of a photograph, a group photograph. Let's imagine that there was a room full of people. All the people on this webinar were in a room together, and somebody took a group photograph, wide angle lens, captured everyone in the picture. Each of us got a copy of that photo. I can say with confidence that we would all do the same thing. We would all be looking at that picture, trying to find ourselves in it. That would be the first thing that we would be doing. And so I'd be looking for myself, you'd be looking for yourself. We'd each be looking for ourselves in this picture. But let's imagine that for some unknown reason, somebody has digitally removed a small percentage of the folks in the photograph. I was standing right next to you, Fred, but somehow my picture's been digitally removed. And so I spot you, but I don't spot myself. If I had that experience, if someone listening had that experience, they would wonder what's wrong with the picture. I was there. I saw the flash go off. I was smiling. How come I'm not in this photo? But let's imagine it didn't happen one time. Let's imagine it happened over and over again. I'm in these group photos, somebody keeps removing me, and now I'm not wondering what's wrong with the picture. I'm wondering what's wrong with me. Am I invisible? Have I somehow, you know, been zapped? I don't know, like what's going on? And not only would I wonder that, I would start to feel irritated, if not angry about it. I would certainly start to feel like I didn't want to hang around when the pictures were being taken. You know, if someone said, wait, don't leave, we're going to do a group photo, I'd be the first one out the door if I didn't feel as though I was going to be included in the picture. We know that everyone wants to see themselves in that photograph. And so leaders, whether they're classroom teachers or principals or college presidents or leaders of business organizations, if you are responsible for a group of people, one of the things you have to get in the habit of asking is who's missing from this picture? Because the people who are missing are not likely to be able to give their best if they don't feel included. They're not wanting to participate. They're going to feel checked out. If we want to fully engage students, if we want to fully engage employees, we have to create spaces where they see themselves in the picture. And that A is foundational for B, building community. A group photo is a building community activity. It only works if everyone is confident they're going to be in it. And C, cultivating leadership is a critical skill for all of us to learn how to ask the question, to learn how to create the environment where people can feel included, because that's what will make you an effective leader in the 21st century.
Oh my. Well, how do we build uh, communities where we're all valued and respected? I know that I love the image because in your book, Peril and Promise, you talk about the photograph, and I think everybody wants to be included.
Yes.
But how do we do this across communities that we get in? How do we do this?
Well, I think it does take leadership. One of the reasons I wrote my book, Peril and Promise, was because I really wanted to help people understand the role of the leader in this scenario. And what do I mean by that? One of the things that we know as psychologists is that we have a tendency to think in us-them terms. Who's in, who's out? Societies the world over create insiders and outsiders. But who's in and who's out is not determined by birth or appearance or language or any of those things. It's determined by the adults who are defining defining the group. If a stranger appears, a baby will look to the parent with curiosity, like, is this a safe person or is this a dangerous person? Is this a person who's in our group or outside of our group? If the baby perceives that it's an outsider, the baby might start to cry, right? Might be startled or concerned. But the parent, the leader, can signal, no, this is a member of our group. This is not a person to be distressed about. This is someone who belongs here. That's a simple example, but there are ways that the leaders in our communities, in our organizations, are signaling through their language, through their behavior, through what they model, who's in and who's out. An inclusive leader will use their language in a way that defines the in-group very broadly, creates a big umbrella to include lots of people. When the language is used to define a small group of insiders and everybody else is outside, that increases a sense of danger, of threat, of polarization. So if we want to bring people together, we in our leadership roles, and we all can play a role. Even if you don't have the title of leader, you can still be a leader in saying, this person is part of our community. This person is valued. Just as I'm valued, this person is also valued. And to the extent that you can, through your words and your deeds, create that sense of community belonging, it makes it easier, even when people disagree about policy issues or other things, to engage with one another because that shared sense of humanity has been reinforced.
We, I can really feel that you have given us information in your book, Peril and Promise, about the difficult role that you play as a president of a college or a university. And every time I turn around, there's more problems. There's problems at this university, then problems at that university. And I noticed in your book, Peril and Promise, that you had some very interesting ideas on how to deal with those differences in a very constructive way. And I know that one of the things you talked about was dialogue.
Absolutely.
So tell us about that, because I can't believe you could have been there for 13 years in one place and not lost your mind.
Well, it was a privilege and an honor to serve, certainly a real pleasure to serve for 13 years as president of Spelman College, and also in the years that I spent at Mount Holyoke prior to coming to Spelman, and then returning to Mount Holyoke for a year as interim president just a few years ago. All of that helped me grow as a person, and hopefully I had some things to share that helped the institutions thrive as well. One of the things that, as you mentioned, that I talk a lot about is the value of intergroup dialogue, particularly on college campuses. Not only on college campuses, but college campuses are places where we're bringing young adults together who have often grown up in pretty homogeneous communities. They don't have a lot of practice connecting across lines of difference simply by virtue of where they grew up, where they went to school. So now they're at a college or university where there may be people from all over the world, where there are certainly people from neighborhoods different from the ones that they grew up in. And there are ways that that may feel um, challenging, maybe a little intimidating. And how do we create spaces where people can learn to connect across lines of difference by listening deeply to someone else, even if you disagree with what they're saying, and finding that shared sense of common humanity, working together towards solving shared problems? It is possible, and there's some great examples that I tried to provide in the book of college campuses where people are doing just that, creating structures where students are learning the skill of dialoguing with people whose point of view may be different from their own, but where they're learning to listen carefully and not only listen, but also be heard, and then talk in a civil way about the things where there may be disagreement, but in the process, learning a lot about how to engage with people whose points of view and experiences are different from your own.
How did you I know there was a situation at Mount Holyoke when you were there,
Yes.
and I'm curious. Well, I know the answer, but I don't. The audience may not have had the benefit of reading your book, but how did you diffuse the situation in a way that that affirmed the differences?
Yes, yes. Well, you are referring to the fact that when I served as interim president, that was the academic year 2022 to 2023, there was a student protest. There actually had been a student protest at Mount Holyoke when I served as dean of the college as well. But the one that I wrote most about was that time when I was in the role of interim president, and a group of students this was around the time that COVID was waning. We were, we had access to vaccines, and we were trying to transition from our COVID protocols into kind of back to normal, if we could use that phrase. Um, and one of the things that happened was on our campus, we, following the guidance of our health committee and the CDC, dropped the mask requirement. So students weren't required to wear masks anymore. They could optionally, if they wanted to wear a mask, and certainly they could, but they weren't required to. And there were a group of students who were very upset with this because they felt vulnerable to illness. They were worried that, it would not be a safe environment if we all took our masks off. And so they staged a protest in the main campus administration building, and camped out in the building and determined to stay there until their demands were met. They had 8 demands, and it was the first of which was that we maintain masking indefinitely. So you can imagine that that was not going to fly, right? People were not prepared to say, we're going to wear masks indefinitely. But what was important in resolving the conflict with the students, and it took some time, but what was important was really listening to what their concerns were. It wasn't just, I don't like taking masks off. It was about, I'm concerned for my health and the health of my fellow classmates. Well, I was concerned about the health of you and your fellow classmates too. So we had that in common. We didn't agree on the policy, but we had in common a commitment to the well-being of all of our students. So if we can agree that we both care about that, how can we then work together toward a solution that can meet that need? It took a while to get there, but I will say listening carefully and always trying to find that space of common ground is key to trying to resolve conflicts.
I love the fact that you decided the way to approach any problem at a school is to listen with an open mind and
Yes.
to hear. So I think part of the thing is children, students particularly, They want to be heard. Everybody wants to be heard. And
Yes.
you gave them the opportunity to be heard, to be listened to respect them. And I think that made a big difference because after your presidency, we've had many problems in schools regarding what's going on. And instead of people talking to each other, which is the way to engage and I think to solve problems and find that common ground that can get people working and talking together, some schools haven't done that. They haven't learned that lesson. And instead of dialogue, they're simply taking action that only appears to escalate rather than
Yes. Yes.
de-escalate.
There are many examples in the book, and I really want to lift them up because, you know, the year of the October 7th attack that took place in Israel sparked a lot of student protests. We know that. And there were very strong feelings um, of multiple perspectives. And some campuses devolved into a lot of conflict, and other campuses seemed to be able to work through the issues more gracefully, if I might use that phrase. And when I dissected through the written documents that were available, it was clear that in those places where the emphasis had been placed on listening as a starting point, listening deeply to the concerns of all parties involved, that there seemed to be a greater likelihood of peaceful resolution.
There is one thing also before I get to ABC, which I think is critically important, and I think it's something we can leave with the people who are
Yes.
listening in. Uh, okay, so here I am. I want to do the right thing, but I don't know where to start. I'm overwhelmed. So what one meaningful action can the people out there take to start the dialogue and move from judgment to curiosity? Because that's really what it is about, isn't it? It's get away from judging people and getting into a curious mode. So what's the one meaningful step that we can take to do that?
It's hard to give you just one, Fred, I have to say. But one of the things that I would say right away is that if somebody is sitting at home wondering, like, what is she talking about? Or how could I possibly do that? Then I would invite them to read Peril and Promise because there are a lot of examples of how that dialogue can be engaged with and what makes it hard, but also what can facilitate it. And often, and this was part of my experience working with educators over the years, sometimes bringing people together around a shared reading can be a great way to start. To whether it's reading Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, or my other most recent book, Peril and Promise. That can be a place to start a conversation, to, read something, talk about it together. There's another book which is not mine, but I think it's important to mention in this context because I think it's such a fabulous book. And it's called The Sum of Us, Sum, S-U-M, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And in it, she talks about also the importance of dialogue, but she talks about something she calls the solidarity dividend. And that really speaks to the benefit that comes to communities when they're able to engage in these kinds of conversations across lines of difference. There's a resolution that can come that benefits everyone in ways that make the community better. And that is what I think she means when she says the solidarity dividend. If we can find solidarity with one another, we can all receive a dividend. We can all benefit.
Listen, as a professional mediator, uh, reaching common ground and finding common ground is essential to resolving any conflict. And I think you've done that so well as an educator. We all should be working toward that kind of goal. So before I open this up to questions from the audience, and I'm sure they have tons of questions, um, I want to have you talk about what I consider maybe one of the core values that you have talked about, the ABCs.
Yes.
So I know you've got a slide prepared and you can discuss that, and then we can open up to questions. So, Amanda out there, if you could show us that slide and have Dr. Tatum talk about it with us. Amanda.
And there it is. This is really a summary in some ways of what we were talking about earlier when we talked about A, affirming identity, B, building community, and C, cultivating leadership. If someone said those ideas resonated with me, how do I do that? I would say get in the habit of asking these questions. Who is reflected in our environment? Who's in our picture and who's missing from it? Sometimes just asking that question will trigger something. I'm going to use an example. I'm a vegetarian. And when people are planning the meals for a special event, a community event, I always appreciate it if there are vegetarian items also available to eat. That lets me know someone has said, who's missing from our menu? The vegetarians, right? Let's make sure we have something for the vegetarians or the vegans or the gluten-free people. Who's missing from the picture? Thinking about what identity, whose needs might not be included if we don't have them as part of this conversation. B, building community. How can we create opportunities to bring people together? What opportunities exist for building community? What opportunities exist for encouraging dialogue across difference? There are congregations that have created dialogue opportunities. There are community groups. There are higher education organizations. There are public libraries that are bringing people together in spaces to talk about ideas, read things together. All of that is building community. And C, cultivating leadership. How do we model it so that the next generation can develop those skills? How do we give people the opportunity to practice, knowing that it is a learning process? And the more we practice, the better we get at it. So these are, I think, key questions to putting the ABCs into action. And thanks for letting me explain my slide.
Wow, that's fabulous. Now, Kristen, I'm sure there are people out there that have many questions. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing all of that knowledge and information. And we do have a few questions to start with, but those of you out in the audience, if you have any questions, type them in the Q&A box right now so that we can get to them as we're going to start with these now. We have a question. Not all leaders see the value of creating an inclusive community, and some even see exclusion as a goal. What is the best way for someone without much power to facilitate the inclusion of everyone in the photo?
Yes. Well, one of the things that I think is really important is to recognize, I'm just going to step back for a moment and say, when I would talk about these ideas in my classes with my students would often say, well, what can I do? I don't have any power, right? There was a sense of powerlessness that many people experience. But one of the things that I used to say to them is, everyone influences someone. We all have a sphere of influence, whether that is whether the sphere includes people in your family, people in your social groups, people in your community organizations, your worship communities, whatever it might be, sports teams, we all engage workplace. I mean, we all have people we influence, and we don't always know who's watching what we're doing. But when people are noticing the language you use, how you include other people, if you're the person sitting at the table who's saying, let's talk about who might be missing from our picture, they might come to say, Kristen always asks, who's coming? Maybe I should be asking that question. I was in a meeting and Kristen asked that question. Now I'm in a different meeting. Kristen's not here. I can ask that question. So we never know who we're influencing, but we all have a sphere of influence. Some people have a really giant sphere of influence. Other people, it's not so big. But if you understand you have one and you want to use it, start where you are and influence those people. You never know how far that ripple is going to spread.
Amazing. Thank you. Start where you are. The next question is, do you think enough intergroup dialogue is happening in these fraught times?
No, I don't. I don't think there's enough. I think there needs to be more. The good news is that there are places, I spend a lot of my time on college campuses talking to people. I know that there are places that are building out programs to help students develop those skills. But I want to say that it doesn't have to be just on a college or university campus. And there is opportunity in communities all across the nation where these conversations could be facilitated. And there are community organizations that do that kind of facilitation to try to help people develop the skills. But there is definitely a need for more, for sure.
Thank you. This is a question that kind of dovetails with that one. How do we advance this work in the current political climate, specifically with anti-DEI rhetoric and increased consequences in education, such as loss of funding? How can we sustain the work while trying to keep access to the resources to help us continue to serve students?
Yes. Well, I understand that it's harder to do this work in some places than others. There are some states where state legislatures have, mandated that faculty submit their syllabi, and there's some states where books have been banned, and we know that it's harder in some places than other places. So I don't want to just say, well, just do it, right? I know that there's real concern about, will I keep my job, and those kinds of things. But I will say this, as I said, I visit a lot of campuses, and what I have observed is that those campuses that are determined to keep doing the work are finding ways to do it. They might not call it DEI, but they are finding ways to make sure that all of their students have a sense of belonging. And that, if someone comes and challenges you and says, you know, that belonging stuff you're doing, isn't that just DEI? You can say, it is my obligation as the educator to make sure all of our students have what they need to be successful. We recruit students, we want them to graduate. We are doing what we feel is necessary to create a positive learning environment. Who in their right educational mind can say, no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't create belonging for all your students. Would be educational malpractice. And so we need to be able to say and defend, you know, there's certain terms they don't want me to use. I don't have to use those terms, but I still need to be committed to the well-being of all of my students. And finding a way to do that, I'm encouraged by the fact that I'm on campuses where people are finding ways to do that.
I love it. It's essentially reframing. You're reframing it into a positive. You don't have to call it DEI. You're talking about including everybody and making sure they have the tools to succeed as students. So that's a great approach. Thank you for that.
Yes.
Do we have any more questions out there from the audience? Let's see, if you do have a question, please type it in the box right now. Let's see. More. Okay, here's another question. I teach middle school and find that students are often modeling the ideas of their parents, which aren't helping us foster an environment of belonging. How could I best address this?
I think it is challenging. Of course, students do bring attitudes from home, and those attitudes are not always um, helpful in terms of creating a culture of belonging. But one can also define a classroom space as a place where certain behaviors are allowed and certain things are not, right? So you can say, in this classroom, we're going to honor and respect everyone. In this classroom, we're going to create an opportunity for everyone to feel heard. In this classroom, now, in the context of that, a student might say something that feels offensive or it reflects a stereotype or is hurtful to someone else. And as the educator, it is often the impulse to, check that, right? To say, okay, but I do think it's possible to say in a respectful way, I know that some people think that. But here's what I have learned. Here's the information I have. And that's why in my classroom, we do it like this, right? So you're not saying your parents are wrong, but you're saying in this space, this is how we are going to um, support one another. There may be points of difference. Someone, I'm going to give you an example. Um, a student might say something offensive, reflecting a stereotype. You can ask a question about it. You can say, I'm curious about that. Tell me more about that idea. How do you know that? It doesn't match up with what I know. So I'm curious what I mean, you can have a gently challenging conversation without, um, now in the world of social media, in the world of hyper vigilant parents, you might find yourself with a hot phone call. And at the same time, I'm not saying that I want to be clear that it's easy for me sitting in my chair to say, you should say this or do that. I want to respect the fact that it is truly a frightening time and we know there are examples of teachers who've lost their jobs over a comment or sharing a book or all of that. So it's not an easy time at all. But I do think that particularly if you have the support of the leader in the building, the principal or others, a community of support with your fellow teachers, it is possible to create a context in which challenging conversations can happen. And still, the humanity of the student and the parents can be respected.
Thank you for that. I think we have time. Sorry about that. I think we have time for one more question, and this is Claudia from Ideas. Indigenous peoples are so invisible in popular culture, education, movies, etc. What do you think is the best, most effective starting point for educators and students to integrate all of these perspectives?
I'm coming back to the A, affirming identity, asking the question, who's missing? Um, I think I know Claudia. And so if I do, hi, Claudia, it's good to hear from you. And I would like to just say that providing the information so that people can bring multiple perspectives into the classroom is really important. Teacher training, professional development is part of that. You can't teach what you don't know. But to the extent that we understand that everybody wants to see themselves included, it's incumbent upon us to educate ourselves so that we can meaningfully include.
Thank you. Fred, over to you.
All I can say is I am so grateful that you had the opportunity to speak to the Boston Public Library community. Uh, and I hope that the people out there will share what they have learned with other people. And then we have a rippling effect. And it starts with a dialogue, and hopefully it'll continue with a dialogue, and we will move to a better place. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Tatum. Thank you, Fred from the Citywide Friends. Thank you all in the audience for joining us. A reminder that you can get a copy of Dr. Tatum's books from our partners at Border Square Books, or check your local public library. Link to purchasing the book from our partner at Border Square Books is in the chat. For more information about other programs in honor of Black History Month, and also the Black is book list, which the library compiles annually for readers of all ages, there's a link to that in the chat. You can check that out. Join us for our next talk in the series in person here at the Central Library, March 25th, with Susan McKenty Brady of Simmons University. The topic of her talk will be staying human when things get hard. So the link to register for that will be posted shortly on the Boston Public Library website, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you all for being here, and take care and be well.